Hello, my name is Sarah Hester, and I'm a graduate of Seton Hill University. I graduated in 2020 with my bachelor's degree in forensic science. And while I was at Seton Hill, I was a member of the honors program. And this presentation that you're about to watch is the culmination of my research for my honors capstone. I will be giving an outline of the forensic process when analyzing mass grave sites and how these techniques are used to identify the victims. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education for letting me work with them to make this presentation and my honors capstone a reality, as well as Barbara Flowers. She's both my undergraduate advisor and my honors capstone advisor, and Dr. Christine Cusick, who is the advisor for the honors program. So this presentation will focus a lot on what's known as forensic anthropology. And according to the Smithsonian, this discipline is defined as a combination of the archaeological aspects of physical anthropology and forensic science. And this combination kind of comes to fruition in the adaptation of practiced skeletal analysis procedures that are used by anthropologists to assist in solving criminal cases. And so the entire concept of forensic anthropology is based on reference data. And this data comes from the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, where over the years, physical anthropologists have amassed a collection of over 33,000 skeletons. And all of these skeletons have been measured and analyzed, and all of this data has been placed into a reference database that can be applied to even modern skeletons of today. So the first part of this presentation, like I mentioned earlier, is going to focus on the forensic process and the step-by-step procedure that forensic anthropologists and the teams that they work with take to excavate mass grave sites and identify these victims. So, before an excavation mission can officially begin, forensic anthropologists must gather introductory information so that they have an accurate idea of the scope of the task before they get started. This involves gathering antemortem information, or information that focuses on the events and persons involved in the time leading up to an individual's death. Forensic anthropologists will consult a variety of sources, including questionnaires sent to residents of the area or other survivors, for example, visual aids such as documentation or photographs of the events, perhaps videos if the event took place in more modern times. Additionally, one can consult medical records of presumed victims, as well as eyewitness interviews and accounts, which can tend to lead to the most beneficial information. Another very important resource is antemortem databases, of which a screenshot is pictured on the right. These databases are used by forensic scientists to identify large amounts of human remains in the case of a mass disaster. These databases compile identifying information such as anthropological or odontological, which means having to do with the teeth, to be compared to remains found at mass grave sites that will help aid in the identification process. The next step in this process is to assemble all the elements needed for the excavation. To start, team members with the appropriate backgrounds should be consolidated. This would include forensic scientists, forensic anthropologists, physical anthropologists, historians, pathologists, manual laborers, and other roles specific to the location's requirements. Equipment to aid in the excavation is also an important tool. Depending on the size of the location, large equipment, such as a backhoe, may be necessary. This would also include things like shovels, cameras, brushes, tarps, tents, transportation, trowels, laptops, microscopes, and anything else specifically needed. Arrangements for food and shelter also fall under this category. Lastly, consultations with local experts who are familiar with the area the grave is located in are crucial. These experts will assist the excavation team with such important areas as the safety of the team and insight into the local culture. While an excavation team might have a general idea of where a mass grave is located, it is essential that the entirety of the grave is mapped out so that all victims can be recovered. This process begins by looking for anything that looks like it has been tampered with or is in an otherwise unnatural state. Large-scale searches can begin using satellite photos to look at how an area has changed, or overhead drones to locate visible evidence of a gravesite. For example, this includes irregularities on the surface, such as large mounds or signs of human interaction, and noticeable changes in the vegetation, such as a lack of grass in certain areas, unrooted trees, or patches of dead plants. On a smaller scale, the edges of the gravesite can then be determined based on changes in soil characteristics. There will be a distinct color change between the disturbed and undisturbed soil. Additionally, disturbed soil will have a lower density than soil that has not been touched. Density of the soil can be measured using probes in meters, such as the one pictured here. Continuing on, the gravesite must be classified based on 5 different categories, the first being surface versus below surface. This classification states if the remains were found above ground or if they have been buried. The second step is to determine whether the remains are individual, meaning that each body is separated from the other, or if they are commingled or integrated with each other. Commingled mass graves prove to be the most challenging to identify victims, since portions of skeletal remains can easily be mixed up with another individual. The third step is isolated versus adjacent. Is this gravesite in close proximity to another, or is it standalone? The fourth classification is primary versus secondary. This determination is based on if the remains are found where the victims have been killed, or if they had been moved elsewhere to be buried. Lastly, this site is classified as either disturbed or undisturbed. Disturbed grave sites show evidence of animal scavenger activity or human interaction. At this point, the actual excavation process can begin. Any litter or vegetation on the surface of the grave must be removed. The work area must be staked out. All edges of the grave must be marked to ensure no portion of the site is accidentally left ignored. This outline is continuously referred to throughout the excavation process. After the grave has been clearly defined, the digging can begin. Anthropologists are sure to work horizontally, clearing away layers of soil rather than delving straight down. When the first sighting of potential remains are discovered, work is halted and the discovery is documented. Documentation generally involves detailed note-taking and photographic records. When possible remains are discovered, it can be difficult to determine if the item one has unearthed is actually bone. The material is not necessarily intact and has been in less than pristine conditions for an extended period of time. In cases where determination from a professional based on visual appearance is not plausible, there are microscopic and chemical methods that can be used to identify an object as bone. On a microscopic level, bone is comprised of cells called osteons, seen here on the right. These structures are visually similar to a tree trunk, with each trunk being a distinct osteon. If osteons are seen when analyzing an unknown object, the material is bone. Furthermore, if these cells are arranged in rows, the bone likely belongs to an animal. If the osteons are arranged randomly, such as in the picture, the bone likely belongs to a human. Additionally, there is a chemical method to determine if a material is bone. There is a portable instrument known as an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. This instrument excites a sample using an X-ray and then measures the fluorescent X-ray emitted from the sample in response to this excitement. Each element of the periodic table reacts differently to the initial X-ray, resulting in unique secondary X-rays. This allows the instrument to determine which elements are present in the sample. Bone has a distinctive ratio of calcium to phosphorus present in its elemental composition. If this ratio is present based on the results of this chemical analysis with this instrument, the sample is deemed to be bone. Once remains are found, the features must be pedestaled, like the photograph on the right. Slowly and carefully, the rest of the remains must be exposed without moving, disturbing, or damaging any of them. This can be a complicated task which calls for a steady hand and delicate tools. Once everything is exposed, action is again halted so that proper documentation can occur. Remains are then removed from the grave, as well as any evidence, such as clothing or personal belongings, that are found with them. To ensure nothing is missed, anthropologists continue to remove the remains and evidence until soil that is undisturbed or sterile is reached. Everything is carefully transferred and packaged together with proper labels and materials so that it can be referenced and analyzed at a later time. A recent and extremely helpful development in the excavation process is the use of electronic mapping to document grave sites. This method uses 3D technology to plot the locations of recovered remains in relation to both the edges of the site and other remains. One situation in which this process is extremely beneficial is in the legal system. Many of the individuals who committed such atrocities are still being brought to justice. As forensic anthropologists excavate these mass grave sites to unearth evidence against these perpetrators, electronic mapping is a useful tool to help the court visualize the scope of the defendant's actions. Once remains are exhumed, the process of laboratory analysis can begin, helping forensic anthropologists to determine the identity of the victims. Once the remains are in the lab, any clothing or artifacts that are found with the remains are logged. If necessary, remains are defleshed, generally using a high-pressure water hose. An odontogram, which will be discussed in more detail later, is created for dental comparisons. The skeletal remains are then x-rayed. An autopsy is conducted to determine cause of death if possible. Since victims of genocide are often subject to violence, certain situations, such as physical trauma and the presence of projectiles, are accounted for. In the case of trauma that has caused significant damage, the bones are reassembled to the best of the pathologist's ability. Projectiles such as bullets are detected using instruments such as a fluoroscope, illuminating these foreign objects in the body. This picture on the right shows an example of a fluoroscope being used to locate a foreign object, in this case a bullet. There is a specific order of analysis that is followed when scientists begin the process of identification determination. This order is age estimate, sex differentiation, ancestry identifications, stature estimate, weight estimate, handedness, trauma analysis, disease history, muscularity, and habitual activity. The age of an individual can be determined by a few key areas within the human skeleton, the first being the skull. The skull has distinguished sutures that display age based on how connected, defined, and/or smooth they are. Additionally, within the skull, the stage of tooth eruption and the development of molar roots are also a way to determine age. The epiphyses, or ends, of certain bones also display telltale signs depending on how calcified they are. These bones prominently include the ribs and vertebrae, although analysis of the clavicle, sternum, scapula, iliac crest, ischium, and sacrum are also helpful. Lastly, the pubis undergoes significant changes as one ages. So looking at characteristics such as the development of ridged surfaces or ossification can provide an estimate. On a microscopic level, more osteons are found as an individual ages. So the more osteons, the older the individual. All of these determinations are combined to create a probable range of estimate rather than a specific age. The use of a range allows for greater flexibility in coming up with a positive identification. The sex of an individual is primarily determined by three bones: the skull, the femur, and the pelvic girdle. Specific areas of the skull are analyzed, including the forehead, jaw, facial profile, cranial base, the area where the ear was, and just the overall size, shape, and rugosity. For the femur, generally, a larger femur suggests the individual is male, while a smaller one suggests female. However, this is not always entirely accurate, but generally serves as a jumping-off point for future analysis. Lastly, the most reliable bone for sex determination is the pelvic girdle and the pubis. The female pelvic girdle is broader and wider than the male counterpart to allow for childbirth. Additionally, it is possible to determine if a female has given birth due to the formation of grooves caused by the bone movement during the birthing process. Determination of ancestry is reliant upon the skull. There are three possible classifications: Caucasoid, which describes those of European descent; Mongoloid, which describes those of American Indian or Asian descent; or Negroid, which describes those of African descent. A Caucasoid skull has recessive cheekbones, a narrow nasal aperture, a narrow triangular palate, a curved suture between the cheek and jaw, and a suture present from the top of the nasal arc to a junction of sutures on the top of the skull. There also tends to be an extra cusp on the maxillary first molar. A Mongoloid skull is characterized by forward projecting cheekbones, comparatively flat faces, a moderately sized nasal aperture, circular eye sockets, a wider palate, and a straight suture between the cheek and jaw. Maxillary incisors tend to be more shovel-shaped. A Negroid skull has little to no projection of their cheekbones, more rectangular eye sockets, a broad nasal aperture, a wide rectangular palate, and a slight depression just behind the crown of the skull. Negroid skulls also display prognathism, causing the upper and lower jaw to be more prominent in comparison to those of Caucasoid or Mongoloid skulls. After ancestry and sex determination, the stature of the individual can then be estimated by measuring the length of certain long bones as the femur, tibia, humerus, radius, ulna, calcaneus, and talus, and applying these measurements to regression formulae. These formulae are dependent on ancestry and sex, so these analyses must be completed prior. The stature estimates are accurate to within a few centimeters and are a useful tool for identification. This chart, in particular, shows bone measurements and the related stature estimate based on regression formulae for a particular collection of skeletons. Unfortunately, due to the nature of genocide, victims tend to be the subject of violent actions from the perpetrators. When looking at remains found in these mass grave sites, it is important for the analyst to be able to recognize key evidence of trauma, as well as to be able to distinguish antemortem trauma with postmortem trauma. For example, depending on the conditions of the gravesite, animals may have scavenged the remains, leaving teeth marks. If not identified properly, these marks may not only hide the real cause of death, but might also be mistaken for wounds from a sharp object, leading to an incorrect determination. Signs of blunt force trauma, or the entry of a projectile, are also searched for. Other examples of trauma would be a broken hyoid bone, which suggests strangulation, or particular fracture patterns on cracked bones, which suggests being burned. Other defining characteristics that can be determined to increase the chances of identification include handedness, as in which hand was the individual's dominant one, disease history, muscularity, meaning if the individual was either lean or more muscular, and habitual activity. All of these characteristics can be determined from areas of wear on the bone or areas that are strikingly different from other bones. For example, bones that are not as closely packed in comparison to others, such as what is pictured on the right, would suggest the individual had osteoporosis. All of the previous analyses that I discussed only paint a general picture of who a victim was. They are useful for creating an idea of a person, which can then be spread elsewhere, asking witnesses and checking databases for individuals that meet these descriptions. When a potential match is made, forensic scientists then begin more exact methods of identification. The following methods can only be performed after the general analyses. In addition, scientists must have an idea as to who this individual could be. Depending on the technology and instruments utilized, these processes can be extremely expensive, resulting in a hurdle commonly found in identification missions. The identification of personal belongings that were found with victims is best used when remains are being exhumed while the generation that was targeted is still alive, as neighbors, family members, and close friends who are survivors are likely to recognize the belongings of a loved one. The picture I have here is from a particular excavation that took place in Rwanda, where anthropologists hosted a clothing day for relatives who suspected they had lost a loved one in a genocidal act of violence a few years prior. Each article of clothing and other artifacts were tagged so that the excavation team knew which set of remains they were found with. If an individual recognized a particular object as belonging to a particular person, the potential identity was connected to those remains. In cases where a family member of the deceased was present, mitochondrial DNA samples from the mother or other female relatives were taken for future genetic analysis. This process will be discussed shortly. Another method of identification is the comparison of dental records. Unique characteristics of the teeth, including the absence of certain ones, are documented in an odontogram, which relies on a numbering system to refer to a person's teeth. There are three commonly used numbering systems. There's the FDI system, which is used in Canada and was developed by the World Health Organization. There is the Palmer numbering system, which is used in the UK, and the Universal numbering system, which is used in the United States. Once an odontogram of a deceased individual is made, it is able to be checked against previously existing dental records that belong to the person that they are suspected to be. Facial reconstruction is extremely helpful in reaching out to the public to help identify an individual. A face is much easier to recognize than a few characteristics grouped together. This method is based on measurements taken from reference data on skin thickness in the face and head based on age, sex, and ancestry. In clay reconstructions, markers of the same thickness are placed in all the corresponding areas on a model of the skull. The space between these markers is then fleshed in with clay to create a base for the rest of the reconstruction. From here, professionals do their best to add distinguishing features that fit the individual and make an identification possible, such as eye color, angle ears, hair, things of that nature. Recently, computer programs have been developed that are able to perform this entire process digitally, leading to a quicker final result. Sketches are also a possible method of facial reconstruction, although this technique is rarely used and does not have much success in comparison to these other methods. The concept of photographic superimposition involves layering two photos over each other using a computer program so that both images are visible. In a forensic application, a photograph of the skull is superimposed onto a picture of the suspected victim in life. An analyst looks to see if specific areas of the skull correctly align with the person's photograph. If even one of these areas is not lined up correctly, it cannot be that individual. This method actually led to the identification of Dr. Joseph Mengele, a Nazi known as the Angel of Death during the Holocaust. Dr. Mengele had fled to Brazil and had been posing as Wolfgang Gerhard. When Wolfgang died in the late 1980s, skull photograph superimposition was able to positively ID him as the Nazi doctor. While less common, photo superimposition can also be used on other parts of the body. Some cases have made comparisons to X-rays taken in life to the skeleton of the deceased. One particular instance utilized the unique pattern of an individual's frontal sinus to generate a positive ID. Lastly, genetic analysis is the most reliable, yet most expensive option. It is generally only used as a final method and when DNA is available to be tested. In order to extract DNA from the remains, there are 3 methods that are used the most. Which one is chosen depends on the condition of the remains. The first is organic extraction by phenylchloroform. This is a 2-step process that separates the sample by density due to the addition of chemical reactants, and then isolates the DNA. It is best used for bones that have not been buried and were instead found on the surface. Another method is extraction from crystal aggregates. Bone is comprised from crystals made of minerals. This method relies on extracting DNA solely from these crystals by decalcifying the bone and separating out the DNA. It is known for its success at removing environmental inhibitors, or factors from the environment that prevent the analysis of DNA, and is therefore considered a reliable method for bones that have been buried. Lastly, extraction by total demineralization calls for the complete dissolution of a bone sample to isolate the DNA for analysis. This method is good for non-buried bones and is considered the most effective method, although there is a higher chance of contaminated DNA. The DNA used in these type of cases is mitochondrial DNA rather than nuclear DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is found in bone and will persist longer than nuclear DNA, making it easier to analyze and look for in cases where the genocide took place a long time ago. The best part about this type of DNA is that it is passed solely along the maternal line, meaning that an individual will have the exact same mitochondrial DNA as his or her mother, which is why, when possible, a mitochondrial DNA sample is collected from the mother of the suspected individual. The DNA is then compared using a method known as gel electrophoresis, pictured here, which sends a charge through the isolated DNA, which separates it in fragments based on size. If the same pattern of fragments is found in both samples, this leads to a positive identification. So, over the course of my research for this presentation, I realized that this identification process hasn't actually been done for a lot of grave sites associated with the Holocaust. And I feel that the reasons for this are important to discuss to give a more inclusive picture of the overall situation. We are currently in the 3rd generation after the Holocaust, and this generation feels a distinct divide when it comes to speaking on the matter. They want to, and they would like to advocate for justice, but also at the same time don't feel like it is their place to. There's a mentality of, I wasn't directly involved, and therefore I shouldn't speak out. There's also an increasing inability to access information firsthand. Unfortunately, many of the survivors or citizens who were alive during the Holocaust are now elderly, ill, or may have already passed. Others still don't want to discuss what they have witnessed or lived through. This overall disconnect has actually led to an increase in literary publications on the Holocaust, some of which are pictured here. These are actually all screenshots from current resources available for sale on Amazon. Many feel that this is the best way to conquer that divisive feeling while still speaking out. Additional reasons for the lack of forensic identification of victims include the large scale of the task. Millions were killed during the Holocaust throughout multiple locations, and organizing a mission to process all of this is expensive, time-consuming, and complicated. Another reason is that, while some of these mass graves were located, they were located only to prove that they existed, and no exhumations or identifications were performed. This reasoning actually links to a mentality that these communities are content with the information that they already have. The existence of the site itself can be used to bring justice to the perpetrators, and for some, this is enough. In addition, images of the dead are a major component of the Holocaust. Media publications at the time, and even modern news reports, focus on pictures and videos of the masses of remains that were being discovered. As a result, many believe that since they can visualize so many bodies, the majority of the victims have already been found. There is also a belief that the Nazis have destroyed all physical evidence tying them to the crimes, as this image was also circulated during the regime. Lastly, the Holocaust and the events that took place during it sparks a lot of emotions, whether that is trauma and pain for survivors and witnesses, or the relapse of more violent thought processes, triggering racism and an urge to place blame for what happened. The politics of modern society would suffer under such mass negativity, and many don't often want to do anything that would incite such feelings. While these are all prominent reasons as to the lack of identification of Holocaust victims, the most influential one is that Jewish law is against disturbing graves. Current exceptions to this belief are if the remains are under threat, like in the case of erosion, or if they have been scattered so that they can be collected and reburied. This also forbids the scientific analysis of remains. However, there is some debate over this in modern day. Many Jewish religious leaders, while acknowledging and respecting their beliefs, understand that this isn't a very typical black and white situation. The individuals who died during the Holocaust were seriously wronged and were not allowed a respectable burial. So there are some who understand the benefits of allowing for these remains to be identified and buried properly. Additional debate stems from the fact that while Jews were the main victims, they were not the only ones. Other targeted ethnic groups may be buried in these mass graves, and some feel they should not remain nameless and indecently buried. Science is largely regarded as a thing of fact, and it can be difficult to see how such a structured concept can lead way to an uplifting, free-forming movement that is open to interpretation. However, the role forensic science plays in human rights situations like these serves as an important stepping stone to justice and peace. I wanted to include in this presentation an excerpt from a speech given by Father Patrick Dubois, a Roman Catholic priest who has led initiatives to locate mass grave sites with the help of Yahad and Unam, a French organization dedicated to these missions. In this quick clip, he explains the importance of this work in bringing closure, justice, and hope to those affected by the genocide.
In Europe, we are European, but we cannot build a modern Europe and a modern world above hundreds and hundreds of mass graves of Jews and Roma gypsies who have been killed like animals. If we don't bury the victim of the genocide, what will we say to Rwanda? What will we say to Darfur if we say we have no time to bury them? And also, it undermines all our values. Secondly, many families write to us from America, mainly, from Israel, with always the same request: in which mass grave is my aunt? In which mass grave is my grandfather? In which mass grave is the rabbi of the village? And now we have many, many families who go back and for the first time will say Kaddish on the mass grave where is the family. They will not know exactly which corpse because we cannot open, but they know at least where the family is buried.
Overall, this process really cements the concept of forensic science in its role as part of the human rights movement. The first documented mission of this nature took place after the Argentinian Dirty War from 1974 to 1983. From here, the movement has only snowballed, leading to increased funding, participation, interest, and scope of abilities. In these situations, forensic anthropologists serve as human rights workers and ambassadors, navigating potentially tricky concepts as cultural sensitivity, linguistic differences, cultural flexibility, the recognition of normal burial customs for the location they are in, the ability to conduct interviews with families on touchy subjects, their knowledge of local laws, and their accommodation of local customs. To summarize, these missions truly have an impact on both local communities and just modern society as a whole. The dead are often identified, bringing closure to families and friends, and the physical evidence is often used in legal prosecution against the perpetrators of such abhorrent acts. The families of the dead no longer have to guess about what happened to their loved one. The leaders of the nation who may have been instrumental in carrying out these actions will receive justice. The citizens of the world will realize that these actions will not go without consequence, and we can take another step towards a more caring and unified world.